Well, Russell has a question. He says, there seems endless attempts to create us versus them controversies like right versus hard left, globalists versus nationalists, DC elitists versus average citizens, patriots versus Marxist, USA versus China, USA versus Russia, etc. How would you suggest evaluating issues raised to determine right versus wrong, as well as contrived versus legitimate concerns? Great question, Russell.
Wow, yeah, that's big. That's big. Well, I mean, let's go back to the notion of like Carl Schmitt, the philosopher, a German philosopher, who's considered to be a one of the key theorists of the new nationalism that has risen up. I mean, he argued for the importance of enemies. It was very interesting. And the argument is, if you don't have enemies, then you're operating with universal categories. In other words, everyone who is normal is for this. And therefore, if you're not for this, you must not be normal. You must not be human. And so you probably should be exterminated or something akin to that. All of our thoughts, all of our political ideologies have to have boundaries. They have to have borders. So one of the concerns in the United States is the United States an idea, or is it an identity? Is it an actual people? Is it an actual nation with borders and boundaries, and so on? And the way, that you don't have to pin those two together. It is an idea that has boundaries and borders and the people and so on. But neocons and neoliberals are virtually united in this notion that human rights, women's rights, minority rights, right? They have no boundaries. These are rights that extend to all humans. They extend to all women. They extend to all minorities. They extend to all LGBT. And therefore, there is no basis for demurring from this. There's no basis for being able to say, well, wait a minute, I don't agree with that. So you're against humanity then. When you say I'm against human rights, how are you against human rights without being against humanity? Or how are you against LGBT rights without being against LGBTs? How are you against women's rights without being anti-woman? So Carl Schmitt, back in the day, argued this is why we do need to recognize that whatever worldview we're putting forward, it's got to have boundaries and it's got to have borders. It's got to respect other belief systems in the same way you expect those belief systems to respect yours. So this is something that Alexander Dugin is developing in what's called the fourth political theory in the Heideggerian conception, Dasein, which means simply the right to be. That every culture has an equal right to exist as any other culture does. Now, that does mean you're going to have some pretty creepy cultures out there. And our culture may be one that says we should try to convince creepy cultures not to be so creepy. And Dasein would argue that's fine. The fourth political theory would argue that's fine. But you first do have to recognize there are limits to your worldview. You're not allowed to impose your worldview on other people. And then, so I would argue, I would start there. To what extent are these conflicts happening because the worldview considers itself universal? Either you buy this or you don't belong in the human race. You don't belong in human society. If you're dealing with that, you're dealing with a supremacism that's cyborg-like, you like in the Star Treks, resistance is futile. You're just going to be absorbed into this Borg, and there's nothing that you can do. So I would start there. That's, I think, a helpful thing. So in most nationalist movements that you're seeing all over the world, while they can be certainly quite messy, They're unique in that they're not like the 20th century nationalist movements that tended to be imperialistic, that wanted, say, a Nazi fascism to be the new world ideology that conquers the planet. Okay. Nobody is arguing that right now. Nobody, not even China, has gotten that far yet. I mean, they're pushing some boundaries, no question, but they haven't got, because they're thinking in old empire terms, restoring the glory of the Chinese empire. Same with Erdogan in Turkey, for example, and the Ottoman Empire. So they are thinking in those terms, but again, it's still geographically limited. So if you have a belief system like liberalism that is inherently universalistic, where there is simply no basis to be able to, what's the word I'm looking for? The word just I have in my mind is to demur from it. There's no basis to offer an antithesis, an alternative viewpoint. If there is no alternative view, you're either for women or you're against them. There is no alternative. Then you're dealing with a belief system that is inherently violent, that is inherently imperialistic, and that is inherently colonizing. It will seek to impose itself. This is what happened with Afghanistan. Afghanistan went from being a democratic project into becoming a woke progressive project with a rainbow flag flying in the Kabul army base at one point. I mean, and with feminist movements going on there, and and George Floyd murals being painted was absolutely absurd, and there was no way it was going to last, because it's seen as a form of colonization, which it is. It's ideological colonization. So I'd start there. Second thing is, you want to know your test for truth. You want to make sure you have a sense. Having said that, I know this is complicated. Having said that, that doesn't mean that truth is itself limited. It may mean my own cultural expression of truth is limited, and I have to respect that. But that doesn't mean truth itself is limited. Truth by its nature transcends time and space. Something that's true is always true. And God himself is truth. So we have to know our tests for truth to be able to evaluate arguments. And the tests for truth are generally logical consistency, empirical adequacy, and experiential relevance. Those are your three tests for truth. You want to make sure something is logically consistent. So if someone's contradicting themselves all the time, what they're saying can't be true. By definition, all you'd have to do is argue with me. You prove the point, right? Because you're arguing for one position over and against its opposite, but that's the law of non-contradiction. Two contradictory views can't both be true. So it has to be logically consistent. That doesn't mean it can't have mystery and nuance and so forth. No question. But whatever it is, has to have some logical consistency. It has to have some evidence behind it. That's its empirical adequacy. And then it has to mean something for our lives. That's what's known as experiential relevance. And that way you can evaluate arguments. This is what I tried to do with the Ben Shapiro, Malcolm Nance debate. Tried to just kind of walk viewers through that, which I'm really happy. We got over 100,000 views on that. And a lot of people gave us some feedback saying, thank you for this. This is a really nice masterclass in critical thinking. So I just think if you take those two things, that can take you a long way. Make sure you know that whatever belief system you're holding to, it does need to respect some boundaries. It does need to respect some borders. We in the Patriot movement are a very, very religiously diverse group. We're also ideologically diverse. There's libertarians and anarcho-capitalists, and there are more, economic nationalists who are more protectionists. There are interventionalists. You name it. There's muscular government. There's limited government. But we're all united in the fact that we are fighting against a permanent political class that is trying to colonize us, in effect. So I think you need to be very respectful of borders and boundaries. on the one hand, and then on the other hand, in almost kind of a paradoxical fashion, recognize that truth is truth. There are belief systems that are simply not true. They don't work. Make sure you're able to evaluate that, but then always show a certain level of expression, a certain level of a measure, and a certain level of humility in pushing your own understanding of that truth on other people, because we're all in different parts in our journey. We're all coming from different cultural vantage points. There is truth. Our cultures are all trying to wrestle with that in some way, and we're all doing it at different levels. And I think if you respect borders while at the same time are able to evaluate arguments, that's going to take you a long way to be able to determine what's a legitimate, okay, we just don't see eye to eye here. And what is an illegitimate one is, well, wait a minute, now you're a colonizer. You're just trying to impose your one size fits all political economic system on all people, times, and places. I hope that helps with that.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much.